So in the study design, we're trying to understand the risk factors for the development of a potential outcome. And what is that outcome, etc., we'll be asking about. So we're going to ask the question. So if we ask the question now, we have to identify these outcome cases and no outcome cases. And then if we're asking the question now, we're going backwards in time to try and ascertain what risk factors went into the development of these cases. So this is a retrospective design where we ask a question, we look at an outcome, and we try and understand what risk factors, etc., or associated things helped or went into the development of said outcome. And if you think about it like this, we can talk about the disease being present, the disease being absent, and we're looking for the exposure being present or absent in each of the groups. And in this design, we can set up our 2x2 table like this. We've spoken about it a little bit this morning. So when you have cases and controls, we're analyzing the table this way. So we're looking for the odds of having exposure A or B in each of the case or the control. So instead of going across this way, we're analyzing this way, down like that. And so in order to do that, we need to analyze and think about the odds ratios in this particular study design. So let's go through a literature example. So this is just an example of helmet use and the risk of head injuries in alpine skiers and snowboarders. So who would think that it would be a good trial design to stand at the bottom of the mountain, handing out helmets and saying, we're randomizing you to helmet, we're no helmet. Randomizing you to helmet and no helmet. That's a good design, right? What are the implications of that?
Safety.
Well, there's safety, there's ethics, there's all that sort of stuff that go into that. So in this instance, this is the way they did it. They said they want to determine the effect of wearing a helmet on the risk of head injury in skiers. There. A clear point, a clear question. Just because this is a retrospective design, this is a clear question that they're asking. What's the best way to ascertain this? Well, they looked at thousands of patients in Norway who went skiing, and they wanted to find out, of those people who had a head injury, how many of them were wearing helmets or not. And the controls that they ascertained were the people, every 10th person going up the mountain was also a control. So they did this logistic regression to look at some of the aspects and things that went into those who developed a head injury, and found that head injury was higher when you did not have a helmet. And so through this design and through looking at the odds of having a helmet or no helmet and a head injury, they ascertained that helmet use was associated with a 60% reduction in the risk of head injury. And you can see that they give us an estimate of effect using the odds. They give you an estimate of the risk reduction, and they give you an estimate or the precision of the effect with a confidence of 0.3 to 0.55. So the study design was retrospective, but they're giving us all the things that we need to try and think about, is this associated or not? So when you think about doing a case control, the first thing to ask is, well, what is your question? So some questions like, well, what's the odds of developing OA of the knee if you're in varsity level sports? What's the odds of a re-rupture if the ACL reconstructs before it needs a double bundle or single bundle? And you have to think about the cases that you get. So when you look at the outcome cases, what are they, and what time frame did you select these cases? You'd like to select them as soon as the outcome happens, because there are other modifiers that can modify the way that outcome is over time. And the longer it is from the time of diagnosis, these other confounding factors can come into play. So you want to get sort of cases that are incident cases. Then you have to ask yourself, well, what is this? What are we using to make our diagnosis? What was the diagnosis of head injury made, if we use our example? Is it little head injury, big head injury, axonal, all that sort of stuff, right? Is it major bleeds? Is it axonal damage? So you have to actually establish yourself a criteria for what's the diagnosis that you're going to make, and then let's think about what's associated with that. You need to think about the records and classify and all that sort of stuff. So in terms of selecting the controls, you want to kind of have an unbiased selection. There's a couple ways to do it. One can get random samples. A person seeking medical care from the same institution, the same area, neighbors, etc., if you're depending on what the study is. But you need to think about who the controls are going to be and how you're going to get those controls, because as we'll see in a second, there's can be problems. So in the control group, if this exposure is overrepresented in the controls, then that's going to potentially underestimate the odds, right? And if the exposure is underrepresented, then it's going to potentially overestimate the odds. So, and you need to apply your eligibility criteria. So this last sentence, the point cannot be included as controls if they have no chance of exposure. So would this study have had any merit if we looked at everybody on the hill and then we went into the chalet and got all of our controls from the chalet, none of whom stepped foot on the hill? Would that make sense? No, it wouldn't make sense, right? It's not going to make sense because they're not even going to be on the hill. They haven't been exposed. So that's the point is they have to have some likelihood of having had the exposure. Now, when you measure the exposure, that's also an area of potential bias. And if you think about, well, what's my exposure going to be? Personal interview. Did you wear a helmet? Did you really wear a helmet? Come on, be honest with me. Did you wear a helmet or not? That sort of thing. You're doing well, aren't you? Come on. When we're in the clinic, how many times do that? Everything went fine, right? That sort of thing. So there's ways that you can ask questions and you can instill and inflict bias and that sort of thing. The hospital records are good if they've actually documented that you've had an exposure or not. Maybe there aren't any documentation. Doing well, VSS. How many times did you write that sort of thing? So the other thing is, is it physical stuff we're measuring? Is it lab tests, that sort of thing? Who's getting these results? Are the people blinded to potentially exposure or not exposure? Who's collecting these results? And then think about the validity and the reliability of your measurements and the techniques that you're using to measure the exposure. Now, the other aspect is this issue of confounders. So you need to kind of build in some sort of control, and there's controls up front at the beginning, so you can match for X, Y, and Z potentially in some of these controls. And then there's downstream ways to control for confounding. So that's adjusting the analysis, doing regression models to see how much of what predicts our outcome. So just like in trials, there's upfront ways to decrease your bias when you look at your controls for potential known prognostic factors or confounders, and there's downstream ways to control for that. And often that's some statistical testing that you need to do, which is why it brings back the point of having statisticians on board when you're doing these trials and really thinking about how you're going to set this trial up and that sort of thing. So the limitations of a case control is that you may not have the information there. If you're looking through charts, etc., it may not have been recorded 5 years ago. Getting a representative selection of cases may be difficult. Finding the controls that you want may be difficult. And then there's this issue of recall bias, and I don't remember if I lived under wires, that sort of thing. And then there are other issues of confounders in terms of the time of the diagnosis, etc. And things like if you're assessing smoking and someone is not exposed but they live with 4 smokers, like that's an issue that you have to sort of sort out when you do it. But the advantages are that you can get information and data to generate hypotheses and to generate answers in a short time. You need a smaller sample size. You can do it with less money. And sometimes it's the only thing that you can do for these really